Welcome everybody to Jerome Carroll's lecture. Jerome comes to us formally from Nottingham, but actually from Stoke Newington where he lives. But at least there were no problems with getting through any floods that were victimising Nottingham. So we welcome him here. I like to make connections between different papers in a season. And last time when we heard Matthew Bell talking about his project, what he gave us was, in fact, the first chapter of a coming book. And the same is true this evening of Jerome's project. He has quite a complicated project. His project title is Tearing the Fabric, the Turn to Experience in mid-18th century German writings. But that's not his title, which, as you probably have noticed and remembered, is Christian August Crusius' hybrid philosophy between abstraction and actuality. And this is to do with the, I'm not quite sure it's located in it, the anthropological tradition. So I think there's a slightly taxing set of concepts and positions to be talked about. And since I suspect none of us have ever read Crusius, the strain may be considerable, but I'm sure you'll make it as easy as possible for us, with which I invite you to start your talk.
Thanks, Jim. Yes. Well, I really appreciate the invite to come and talk about Crusius, because it is part of the book-length project. Indeed, it'll be the first chapter of the book-length project, as Jim says, called Tearing the Fabric. So on the slide there, I realise the screen is a little small, so the thing is, I'm not going to read paper. I'm going to speak from slides. I've got some notes for things that I forgot to put on the slides. So don't worry if you can't read everything that's on the screen, because I'm probably going to be saying it anyway. And I do apologise for not reading my paper. I mean, it's always a difficult choice whether to put you to sleep by kind of droning on over the course of 4,000 words, or to confuse you thoroughly by trying to join the dots between the things that I'm seeing in the screen. And as we all know, the kind of gossamer threads of the history of ideas do need to be treated as carefully as possible. So I apologise in advance for any gaps and jumps in what I say. Yeah, the context, I mean, there is a link to anthropology. I mean, anthropology understood in the 18th century German sense of really an appeal to a kind of holistic approach to the whole, der ganze Mensch, that's most famous from Plattner in the 70s. But various commentators currently think that we need to have a kind of Vordatierung of anthropology to the 40s and 50s. I mean, certainly before Plattner writes his book on anthropology, Schutz claims that psychology needs to be done more like anthropology in 1770. And by that he means holistically. So clearly there's a concept of holism, you know, before the 1770s. And certainly some of the thinkers and the writers in that list are very much committed to a kind of holist approach, particularly the Haller-Medics. But to some extent, everyone on that list is participating in a kind of what I see as a tradition that militates against abstraction in kind of broad terms. The context for that tradition, as I see it, of which Crusius is in the 40s, is the first person I'm focusing on. I'm sure someone will come along and say, well, there's this and there's that before him. But the context of that is, of course, the rationalist kind of background, the dominant rationalist philosophy, which is largely oriented towards what I see as sort of essentialism, by which I mean a desire to find the essences of principles or entities, essences that are deemed to be more or less discrete, more or less self-contained, often simple. So, for instance, you get the mind, which is deemed to be, and this is what Wolff says, deemed to be a simple thing. It's simplicity by virtue of the fact that it can be defined by a single power, namely the power of representation. So that rationalist approach, which wants to see things, separate the world into entities that are simple, discrete, kind of complete in themselves and self-contained, obviously appears in Leibniz's monadology as well. The idea of separating things off to their essential unit, which is enough to define them in total, completely, and distinguishes them from everything else. How successful they are at this is a separate issue, but that's the aim, that's the kind of goal. So obviously there's quite a lot to take issue with then. I mean, I'm slightly straw targeting. I think it's Leibniz himself who refers to those concepts as inevitably abstract and also incomplete. So, there's room for adding things to this approach to that which can be said to exist. They're not saying this is all that exists, but still, that's the kind of ethos, this aim for simplicity, discreteness, etc. The other pole of what might be called a context, the kind of historical context, is of course Kantianism, a priorism, which the last thing to note about rationalism is probably that attempt to aim for entities that are simple, discrete, self-contained, etc., involves what I see and others see, Wolff, for instance, as a divorce of ideas from experience or reality. And in a sense, that's where I see a continuity with Kant, because of course that divorce between ideas and kind of reality, obviously Kant is trying to explain how our grasp of reality is possible, but when it comes to what he terms Wirklichkeit or actuality, he sees that as separate to thought. And he excludes existence from philosophy for that reason, because he wants the grounds of thought, its preconditions, the a priori, obviously synthetic a priori, to be something for thought alone, as it were. He doesn't consider, for whatever reason, I won't explain that now, he doesn't consider existence or experience to be part of that context. So it muddies the waters, as it were. So there's, and my point is that in between those two poles, there's a bunch of philosophy that is very concerned about that tradition. And it's important to fill out that picture of the 18th century with this, what I perceive as a turn to experience, a turn against abstraction. So all of those thinkers in that list are part of that tradition. Sulzer, most famous for adding the affective, appetitive dimension to thinking about reality. So will, feelings, emotion. But to be honest, the Halle medics, a wonderful group of thinkers and writers, wonderful group of essays, are often concerned with embodiment and emotion as well. And they're also doctors, so they're very concerned about practical exigencies, which they see philosophical models as potentially brushing over, ignoring. But Tietens, he's the closest to Kant, really, both in time and in conceptually. In certain terms, for instance, of thinking there's a fundamental gap between grounds and experience. But he's much more tentative about the ability to draw those distinctions that are crucial to kind of Kantian philosophy. Spontaneity from reception, for instance. He just finds it very hard to know what we receive and what is spontaneously given by us. And he's also very concerned about pitfalls of deduction and abstraction. All right, that's only one slide. That's 10 minutes per slide so far. How are we doing? Okay, so the aim of the paper is basically to redress some of what I see as slight imbalance in the secondary literature on Crusius, because there tends to be a reading of Crusius that emphasizes his turn to existence, turn to actuality, in favor of logical approaches, abstraction, etc. Such that when you actually read the books, so the Entwurf from 45, I'll give you the full title in a sec, or Weg in 2 years later, 47, it's remarkable. You just end up thinking you're back in rationalist land, that everything is about, the logical method, the fruits of abstraction, etc. So I ended up thinking, well, surely someone has to say this, that actually, if you really read the texts, there's an awful lot of adherence to rationalist method and principles. But when you read the whole thing, you realize, it's a real mixed bag in terms of the adherence to abstraction, but also the concern to pay attention to actuality in various forms. And so I want to give a paper to redress that, what I see as an imbalance, and highlight the ways in which abstraction is accorded value in Crusius's writings. And then the second part of what I'll do is give a brief survey of the ways in which actuality is thematized and emphasized. But then I want to talk about what we do with that. So the concern would be that it's just enormously contradictory and leaves you with not much useful philosophy in there. But I would rather read it as a kind of hybridity, and I would justify reading it in those terms for two reasons. Firstly, this is getting to the second half of the slide, if anyone's bothering to read that, the sense that you get from Crusius that neither approach is unproblematic. The approach that is abstracting in a rationalist methodology and the adherence to actuality. And one gets the sense against those limitations that you also have a view of reality that's inherently complex. And so underlying his hybridity, I see as an unwillingness to hand reality in toto over to concepts. Thereby limiting the possibility and value of separating out things like necessary and contingent, essential and extraneous, singular and multiple, etc. Okay, so that means that there'll be 4 parts of the paper. Firstly, I'll focus on abstraction. Then I'll focus on the appeal to actuality. Then I'll ask the question whether this is merely contradictory or whether there's evidence for hybridity. And sometimes that evidence is explicit, that he talks about mixed conclusions. But sometimes it's implicit in what I see as his approach, his methodology, which gives us a kind of ideal real spectrum. You can tell that's mine because it's really rather cumbersome. But that's what I see. And then I'll say a little bit, if time allows, although by then you may have had enough, of the limitations that I was mentioning earlier, and the complexity, and what he deems as the need for a kind of contextual approach. All of which I frankly find quite refreshing compared to the rationalists, which is quite why I was drawn to writing on Crusius. So those are the texts, the Entwurf der notwendigen Vernunftwahrheiten from 45, and then the Weg zur Gewissheit und Zuverlässigkeit der menschlichen Erkenntnis from 47. And I'm afraid those are also the last two photos, so it's going to be text heavy. So, abstraction. As I say, you really get pretty quickly into a sense that the aims of philosophy, as far as Crusius are concerned, are inherently abstract. Whether that's in the form of principles or concepts or qualities of substances or powers that attach to entities. And in ways that largely accord with rationalist methodology, which is why I've labeled them as necessary, absolute, simple, and essential. So that his texts are kind of peppered with these as the aims and methods and objects of philosophy. So logical principles, so logical, necessary, not proven by experience, but proven by their adherence to, unarguable logical principles, are the highest ground. Non-contradiction is one he mentions. Ironic, bearing in mind how many contradictions appear in his texts, but sufficient reason is another. And there's plenty of secondary literature on why he actually calls it sufficient cause, so I won't go into that. But the fact that these are deemed to be necessary is, of course, a bulwark against skepticism, as it is for Kant. And it appears in the title of his book, of course, the Entwurf der notwendigen Vernunftwahrheit, as distinct from those that are merely contingent or willkürlich. But it's not just principles, it's also substances, qualities, etc., that he deems to be necessary, and there's lots of evidence for that. Although one notable caveat is that he thinks that the object of philosophy may either be necessary or, at very least, indefinitely enduring. And that kind of mixed quality is evident throughout, because, of course, in terms of philosophical grounds, indefinitely enduring is an absolute world away from necessary. It's entirely empirical. So the other way in which this kind of abstract approach to the aims and methods of philosophy appears is in terms of the idea that we can have experience or phenomena with qualities that don't depend on any other phenomena. They are absolute. So he even says that all relative phenomena, substances, powers, Kräfte, Eigenschaften, depend in some way on absolute ones. Even if he insists that relative substances, powers, or qualities are no less important than absolute ones. So again, a caveat that indicates a kind of broad church in his thinking. I mean, maybe these are the kinds of leaving the door open to empiricism that Kant would come to think of as necessitating his clearing the ground, clearing the conceptual ground before he has to work. So absolute as in non-contingent, non-dependent, but also absolute as in unitary, simple. So the removal of all qualities that might be deemed contingent or extraneous. So Crusius expresses the desire to distill grounds to their simple or essential cause. and that quote there from the vague, the simplest of all concepts, absolved of all other characteristics, primary or foundational powers, those that are, I've translated all of these because I'm hoping it will be read more broadly than just by Germanists, but those that are the least composite, so am wenigsten zusammengesetzt. And I guess that the point about composite and simple is that there's an underlying assumption, probably in rationalism as well as in Crusius's ideas, that composite things depend on simple ones by necessity, which is not necessarily true, but he says it. He says in paragraph 111 of the first book, The Weg, if there are composite things, there must be simple ones. So, yeah, the idea that these things can't have qualities removed from them, and they are complete in themselves. Absolute also as in essential, i.e. it contains an essence, and that expresses what it is. Again, the easiest example is the human, defined as an essentially rational being. So he even says, Crusius says, willing and feeling are inessential. They don't count as kind of intrinsic to the human, as defining for the human. In a way that obviously Sulzer, interestingly, Sulzer wrestles with it, to be honest, if I can be permitted a little digression. Initially, in 1759, he says that feeling is merely thinking before it's come to kind of fruition, the fullness of itself, before it's clear. But in 1763 or so, he then says, no idea determined anything. Feelings determine everything. So, as in, what the driver for activity is not ideas, it's feeling. But back to Crusius, so he thinks here that it's possible to distinguish essence from existence. And he prioritizes the essence, for instance, this rational thinking being. So generality is another kind of mode in which the abstract is preferred. Absolved of all particularity, he says. Particularity can't be part of philosophy proper. So what you get is a position that you could characterize from these excerpted bits as hylomorphic, i.e. the form-content distinction. And form is what contributes to philosophy. And Crusius says that at certain points. He says, true grounds are not to be found in the Inhalte of our understanding, rather in the Art der Verknüpfung und Widrigkeit der Begriffe. And there's plenty of places where he makes that point in the two books. And commentators have acknowledged that debt to that hylomorphism in Kant. And Kant is incredibly praising of Crusius in the main.
I'm sorry, I missed that. It's incredibly
praising. Yeah. Another debt discerned is the kind of categories that Crusius operates and thinks are the form that makes up this grounds of philosophy. So he mentions time, space, and force as preconditions of possibility. And he refers to a priori concepts like quality, Eigenschaft überhaupt, substance, subjectivity, succession, causation, negation, etc. He also mentions logical method, and in particular abstraction as the correct philosophical approach. He says it's the way to access hidden areas, as in that experience isn't enough. Philosophy needs to access hidden areas, and logical method is the way to do that. He calls it the Seele der Philosophie und aller Gelehrsamkeit. So you can see already how bizarre it is to read all of this, knowing that people think Crusius is an adherent of actuality and experience, etc. So, yeah, I'll go down to the idealist ontology as well. So it becomes apparent that his ontology, as well as his methodology and epistemology, is wedded to ideas that are to some extent distinct from or different from, don't have the same kind of ethos as existence or actuality. I mean, I know that's a bit of a crude kind of allying, assuming that existence means something sensory, which is maybe slightly problematic, slightly gloomy, but it's apparent that there is a considerable degree of idealism in Crusius's ontology. So when he refers to sensation, sense perception, which he does a lot, I'll come to that in a second, he does distinguish between outer sensation, which is presumably its physical dimension, sense perception, and inner sensation, also using the word empfindung. And the latter is not determined by the former in any simple sense, in any mechanical sense. So he refers to the inner grounds of any idea as refuting what he calls the Geschwätze of the materialists. And that distinction between inner and outer might underlie his characterization of what he calls Empfindungsideen as ganz geistig. So there's a thoroughgoing idealist ontology in Crusius's ideas. Okay? So this is the hinge. In spite of his concerns about the Geschwätze of the materialists, it is true to say that there is an enormous thread going through his writings that makes an appeal to actuality, as emphasized by quite a bit of the secondary literature. And it's expressed in a range of concepts. Actuality, Wirklichkeit, existence, reality, materiality. He uses the term natural, and I think he means this kind of thing. Particularity. So, for instance, he refers to actuality particularly as being prior to possibility, because obviously that's kind of one of the debates of the rationalists. He refers to possibility as a Wesen des Verstandes. So possibility belongs first and foremost to thought. It's worth registering that he does refer to possibility in both real and ideal terms. So there's ideal possibility, there's real possibility. Ideal possibility is probably more the Wesen des Verstandes side of possibility. But he says real possibility has to be something of which you can say there are things existing that could cause it. So when I come to finally get to my argument, and I make the point about the ideal real spectrum, I think this is key evidence for that sense of that you don't just have one kind of possibility. You have a real possibility and an ideal possibility. And one of them belongs more to the side of Verstand than the other. So he says that actuality is governed by thought, a thing is real when it cannot be thought of as anything but real. So that sounds like thought comes first. Thought determines what is real, as in his idealist ontology. But he also says we can't establish something's reality status from concepts themselves. So principles like non-contradiction or sufficient cause are insufficient for establishing whether something which would be non-contradictory exists in reality. That needs a Betrachtung der Sache. Or often he'll refer to the sense perception as a guarantor. I'll come to that in a sec. But so to give you an example, freedom. He says freedom may be non-contradictory, but that's what he dislikes about sufficient cause, that sufficient cause seems to imply determinism, which precludes moral freedom. But the point he thinks is you can't prove freedom in concepts, in principles. It's what he calls a postulate from experience. And I see where he's coming from. So sense perception is another mode of his appeal to actuality. That he thinks the only means of verifying what actually exists is empfindung, both as a means of verifying its reality status and serving as the ultimate bedrock, the kind of first point whereby we develop knowledge. That's why he calls it the erste Hauptkraft des Verstandes. There's some parallel with Kant there, in that Kant thinks of something thought as actual if it is connected with material conditions of experience. But the difference is that Kant is very much interested in the kind of cognitive preconditions of that experience, so the inner empfindung. Whereas for Crusius, the crucial thing about sense perception is that it contains an inner and an outer element. I think that's why he focuses on it so much. So existence is another term that he uses to indicate this adherence to some kind of actuality, as opposed to conceptuality or abstraction. And he defines existence as the opposite of abstraction. Substance and quality, he says, are abstractions as opposed to existence. I mean, it's a nice conceit that he registers that the concept of existence itself is an abstraction, because we're dealing in abstract terms. Now, here's another important contrast with Kant, because Kant, as I mentioned already, wants to exclude existence from the concerns of philosophy. It's not a quality like any other predicate of entities. It's something different. Why Kant excludes it, I'm not entirely sure, because I'm not a Kantian. I'm not even that good a philosopher. But he just wants it to... I think it's because it's too messy. I think it's because it opens floodgates that he doesn't want to open. And he wants to keep philosophy clean and tidy. I know that's not a very philosophical way of expressing it, but that's my gut feeling about why Kant excludes existence. Crusius has none of that. He thinks existence is an important part of philosophy. And in my view, he uses the term to denote an approach to reality that is at odds with the aims of approaching reality with essences or abstract concepts. And there's evidence for that in both texts, as I've indicated there. So if existence has an essence, it's that it's the opposite of proceeding by essences. And so it's a prime example of that underlying motivation I see in Crusius as the refusal to do what he calls giving reality to concepts. Den Begriffen die Realität selbst geben zu wollen. So, a couple of slides on contradictions, all of which should be fairly self-evident by now. Although perhaps I haven't really mentioned this one, because he does, Crusius does seek out the most simple, as we've said, but he also says that essences of phenomena and qualities may not be singular, they may be multiple. Logical formal method, he pits against natural or common approaches to reality. He claims that philosophy must analyze reality in its natural form, Gestalt. But at the same time, he disparages common knowledge, gemeine Erkenntnis, above which he thinks philosophy must elevate itself. He sees natural logic as lacking all formal reckoning, formalite Rechenschaft. And he sees logical method as the only path to clarity, but he also views, at least as most logicians, die meisten Logici, have presented it, as at odds with the way our understanding works, and thereby most people remain unpersuaded by it, he thinks. And he's also contradictory when it comes to particularity and its status in philosophy, and indeed ontology. So we've already had the ganz geistig quote that we generated from this idea of an inner ground of sensation. But it's also very important to his philosophy that it retains a contact with thought external reality. And that's something he mentions many times in the essays. The Wesen der Dinge außerhalb der Gedanken. So his sense that there's a gap between understanding and logic and wirkliches Dasein. Between wirkliches Dasein and bloßes Sein in Gedanken. I mean, how that's compatible with an idealist ontology, I don't yet know. But I am going to try and make the case, and we're almost done. But this ambivalence, this being torn between abstraction and actuality, could be called a hybridity that shouldn't be dismissed as merely brushing over irresolvable tensions in Crusius's ideas. And I see that as evidence partly in that couplet of inner and outer sensation. Also, what I mentioned, the two models of probability or possibility, sorry, the theoretical and the real dimension, ideal and real possibility. And there's plenty of other evidence for that kind of attempt to be hybrid in his thinking. So, for instance, that he refers to mixed conclusions being valuable, that contain not just first and formal grounds, but determined material. So obviously particular, that's what determined means. Es ist ein Kennzeichen eines guten Verstandes, wenn gewahr wird, wie weit die allgemeinen Begriffe ihrem Zwecke gemäß determiniert werden müssen. So he claims that most judgments contain a priori and a posteriori elements. And he thinks that metaphysics should include proofs that are both logically necessary and empirically highly probable. And perhaps most important for my argument of all, he insists that Figur, which is another word he uses, form, is nothing without materie, and that both are incomplete things. And that reference to those ideas as incomplete stands in marked contrast to his references to existence as complete. Just going to log in here and get out of my computer. Yeah, so he refers to actually existing things as complete. So that's very much in accordance with my sense that his primary underlying motivation is to not give reality to concepts. He thinks that actuality contains an existence which is complete in some way, better, if you will, than concepts. Concepts are trying their best, but then in some way they can never be complete. So I guess keeping his ontology, his idealist ontology in mind, it makes it apparent for me that abstraction is not an enemy for Crusius. It's partly a methodology, but it's partly also the way experience works. And therefore, we have to accommodate both materiality and the ideal on as broad a spectrum of the grounds of knowledge as possible. And obviously the evidence for that is in those concepts I've already rehearsed, the possibility, both ideal and real, that he refers to different types of abstraction. So we've already noted his concept of freedom, which is a postulate from experience. Well, he also refers to abstractions from experience. He refers to time in another interesting contrast with Kant, as kind of tying phenomena to actuality. He refers to space as an abstraction from existence, but it's time that I find most useful as a concept. Well, to be honest, both of them. He says time and space tie experience to particularity. Of course, for Kant, they don't do that. For Kant, time and space are time in particular is a necessary thing we must think in order to experience anything at all. That's how Kant characterizes time. So as a necessary deduction from the possibility of experience at all. Well, Crusius, his attitude and his approach is entirely opposite. He says what time and space tell us is that things are located in particular contexts and moments, which I think is a super valuable kind of idea to have floating around when you're dealing with things which are inherently abstract. So I see these references to, postulate from experience, abstraction from existence, etc., as emblematic of this concern to remain as close to actuality as possible. And I said I would justify that hybrid view with reference to his sense of the limitation of concepts that don't operate by those means. So I've already mentioned the incomplete, reference to time and space as incomplete, but plenty of things are labeled as such. Abstract grounds are called empty or merely abstract, as explaining nothing. Our conceptualization of rules that govern understanding for Crusius is unclear, dark, dunkel. He sees logical abstraction as reductive and therefore epistemologically damaging. Zu großem Schaden der Wissenschaft, he says. And he sees philosophy, the tendency in philosophy to reduce reality to these concepts as problematic. And any undetermined concept, i.e. ones removed from context, he sees as fairly useless. I can't remember, unnutz, it's probably the term. And what's notable in terms of that context of rationalism is that some of those limitations he perceives in the methods of philosophy and approaches of philosophy take issue with the key tenets and key kind of methodologies of rationalism. Necessity, simplicity, essence, all of the things I rehearsed at the start. So he says, distinguishing necessary and chance aspects of experience in reality is very difficult. Attempting it is a schädliche Zerreißung. So tearing the fabric actually comes from Schutz, but we've got a very similar sense of the damage of concepts here. Schutz is the 1770 early psychologist. I'm out of time, really, aren't I? Those are all more or less the same kind of thing. And last slide, the other ground for justifying his hybrid approach, even though it may ride roughshod over some contradictions within his thinking and also some concerns of later philosophers, is to do with his sense of the complexity of reality. Maybe just as a final line, I'll pick out one of those quotes, which is the fifth one, which says, Crusius thinks that the analyst can focus on perfection, die Vollkommenheit derselben, by which I take him to mean that focus on concepts that are simple, absolute, essential, etc. Or one can focus on diversity and relationships in which that concept partakes. Die Mannigfaltigkeit und die Verhältnisse derselben. My sense is that the strength of his concern about taking concepts out of those contexts means that actually the hylomorphism, the desire to have a clean break between conceptual framework and the contents of experience and existence that sit in it, for Crusius, doesn't hold. There are no philosophers in the room.
Thank you so much, Jerome. That was absolutely fascinating. First of all, thank you for bringing Crusius's thought to us in such detail, and I have to say, so lucidly. It was really very effective, I felt. So I open things up for questions. Folks online, always good to hear from you. I should be looking there. Either raise your hand, put things in the chat. I'll pick you up somehow.
Just to start, kind of questions. You've given us a wonderful description of the man's thinking process, the result to some extent, whether it's conceptual or abstract, doesn't matter too much. It's a nice description. I just wondered if anyone who was alive when he was alive had anything else to add to it or take away from it. You mentioned the context. And in philosophy, the context is what somebody's said or done before, and anticipation of what people might be saying once they see what you've done.
Sure.
You would agree with that? Can you?
Yeah.
Give us a slight indication of what was going on. And you mentioned Kant, of course.
Yeah, I mean, Kant is...
Pick up all sorts of disagreements.
Yeah, to be honest, Kant is the only one writing on Crusius that I really know about. Because I haven't explored the reception of Crusius beyond that. Because, frankly, there's going to be enough in the book, and this is only a chapter.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
I mean, Kant's reception of Crusius, I mean, I guess one thing to bear in mind, which I haven't said, is that after the 40s, Crusius goes into a faculty at Leipzig, goes into the faculty of theology.
Yeah.
And so he largely stops working on philosophical matters, which may mean that the opportunity for dialogue and kind of effect is minimized. But Kant, as I say, praises him as the most penetrating philosopher. But when it gets into kind of theological stuff, that's where Kant's main criticisms of Crusius arise. I mean, he does take issue with his some of the aspects of his philosophical thinking, like his, concern to include existence. And there are obvious kind of differences between them in how they treat the categories. Kant is a beautiful writer, and his analysis of everything is amazing. So you can't compare Crusius's treatment of the categories. It's a mention of possible categories rather than the kind of philosophical analysis that Kant will do.
Would it be fair to say that he has at least touched upon one of the most profound questions in philosophy? I don't know if you listened to Robert Bragg this morning.
I didn't.
And Tim Crane had some very sound philosophy, arguing with these physicalists who believe that consciousness could either be an attribute of every particle in the universe or whatever, whatever nonsense I go along to.
Sure.
This particular.
Yeah, the Geschwätze of the materialists. Sure.
But there he talks about, mind and matter, if you like. There are problems there, started by Descartes, etc.
Sure.
Another one came before. And one could argue, I think, even nowadays, that there's no true answer to the consciousness problems that have been bubbling like mad for the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Touched upon it a bit with his inner and outer nationality and person.
Yeah. I suppose what I like about his approach, apart from obviously he comes in a tradition of kind of palpable awareness of the limitations of conceptual thinking, from Thomasius through his teacher Hoffmann, and so that's an obvious tradition that people know about. But what I like about it is that it makes the kind of awareness of the limitations of our thinking part of the philosophy. Rather than saying, we'll stop there, it says, no, I'm going to include existence as more than just some kind of brute facticity, because it doesn't suit my model or my conceptualization of philosophy as dealing with the preconditions of thinking.
Interesting that he became a theologian.
It is.
One of these physicalists teaches that theology leads humans.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Taytons also leaves philosophy, which is a great shame. He goes on to become a civil servant. So they're clearly, the power of what will come is too strong. Kant terrifies them all off the stage.
Thank you. Kevin.
Thank you for that wonderfully lucid exposition. It's not very easy to, from the terms of this, but I think it's wonderful. What he's on about and why he might matter. There were terrific developments. He had a follow. There were for a while big debates going on between the two parties, which again is a sign that he was, as it were, not just doing something crazy. He was touching on some real important issues. My question is a completely different one, which is a very much simpler one. So you're trying to focus on this interval, if you like, between kinds of rationalism, different flavors, of course. How does your approach relate to or vary from Panayotis Kondylis? Do you know that book about Aufklärung, which the whole gist of which is that it's there is this massive turn to experience in the philosophy of the Enlightenment. this is a book that's registered very strongly in Germany, and that people constantly, 1990s, 1980s even.
Yeah.
So it's not a new book, but in Germany it's always there as a sort of point of reference, and it's been strangely absent, I feel, from way.
Yeah. Do you know what?
German.
I'm embarrassed to say the name rings a bell, but you might have saved me the trouble of finishing my book. I assume that it will have different kind of load point or touch points.
To be honest,
if it doesn't, I'm really stuffed.
I don't remember Crusius featuring strongly, but I may be wrong there. But,
sure. Kevin, I really appreciate the reference.
But in a way, even within Wolffianism, there is a sort of flavor of giving more attention to experience. And then when Leibniz's pensées come on stream, which only is after his death, and in effect the bringing in the unconscious into philosophy, the Leibniz's petite perception come in and make quite an impact.
Sure.
Baumgarten, Meyer, Schulze.
Yes, although my understanding of Leibniz's approach is that he's still an adherent of the so-called Stufenleiter model of knowledge, which and that's why Schulze is in that period between 1759 and 1763, there is quite a radical, kein Idee kann bewegen. I think that's what he says. Well, that's basically saying.
My sense is that Cornelius is interested in that development.
Sure.
Anyway, it might be.
Maybe I've read an article by him and not the whole book, but I'll chase you for the reference. Thanks, Kevin. Sorry. But I completely take the point that Wolff, he writes a psychology, for goodness sake. But he also says that he's also, in a way, adhering to that partition between philosophy and psychology, which is, in a way, what this project is sort of questioning.
So that just prompts another just point of information. Does Crusius write about any other kind of philosophy other than logic, metaphysics? Wolff, of course, is writing about everything. Does Crusius ever stray beyond?
Well, he strays into theology
but
in the 50s.
Write about ethics or.
He does, and I can't remember what the book is called, but he does have ethics. But it's not as substantial as these two books. But then he strays into. His whole concern with the principle of sufficient reason is because it makes ethics redundant. So that he is morally interested in practical philosophy. But I guess the point about Wolff, the last thing I'd say about Wolff is he does say that essence and Wirklichkeit have nothing to do with one another. So yes, he's interested in the kind of the empirics of the mind, but he maintains a firewall. Thanks. Browbeating them into submission.
Thanks very much. I learned a lot, and my question comes from a position of ignorance because I haven't read Crusius. But I wonder whether we can return to the question of Crusius's relation to Kant, because a lot of what you described in his various philosophical positions sounded to me a lot like Kant. And when you said, for example, if I understood you correctly, the difference between Crusius and Kant on experience is that for Crusius it contains an inner and an outer element, whereas for Kant it doesn't. Surely for Kant, experience contains an external element.
It's not that it doesn't,
Right.
it's that he's not philosophically interested in the outer element.
Right. Okay.
He's interested in the inner ground and wants philosophy to be about that.
Okay. So then, is the difference between them a difference of, because towards the end of your paper, you seem to be saying that the difference between them is a really fundamental one, in the sense that, perhaps if I understood you correctly, Crusius is interested much more in concrete particularity of experience than what Kant is.
Yes.
Or is it one of nuance? Because I think we can't say that Kant is not interested in external experience, because obviously you don't know the info isn't there. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to have an experience for something to think about it.
Yeah.
So where does he sit? Where do they sit together? And I suppose related to that, why, and I think you're getting at it, why does this really matter?
Mm.
Does it matter for the way that we do Kant, for example? Does it matter for the African picture, 18th century German philosophy? What's the bigger picture?
Yeah, I suppose my sense is that Kant wants to exclude empirics, which is why he excludes psychology. So he wants to have a philosophy that's to do with cognitive capabilities and categories, but that wants to exclude everything but the conditions of possibility. So he says, yeah, without content, it's empty, but he wants his philosophy to be empty. He wants it to be pure. Well, Crusius thinks that not just that it's empty, but it's damagingly empty. So, which is why he wants to include things. I mean, he doesn't mention this as much as Sulzer, but he includes reference to diet, for instance, embodiment. So, and obviously certain dimensions of materiality in that kind of outer Empfindlichkeit. So it's really important to him that philosophy doesn't seek the kind of purity of conceptual framework that has no truck with empirics or experience, whereas Kant's transcendental project makes that its stated ambition. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I do think there's something at stake. It's a whole attitude to what philosophy needs to include in order to be serviceable.
I think for Kant, the problem really is about the ethics. It's when he comes to ethics that he's most concerned about sensuous experience, because it's contingent.
Sure.
In terms, whereas of course he wants all ethical principles to be absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
So I think part of Kant's problem is that everything is tied together.
Yeah.
The epistemology and the aesthetics and the ethics are all tied together into one system. Yeah.
Even though the CPR was written well before the.
Yeah, I think so, because I think he probably already knows where he's going.
He'd had 10 years to get his ducks in a row.
That's my sense of it, I think.
Sure. Yeah, fair comment. But I do think that they are markedly different, not just in nuance, but in what they think is for the good and bad of philosophy.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'm not really quite sure where we are now. I've always regarded as, in the end, reconciling these two elements of abstraction and concreteness. And the two titles that you quoted earlier on Gewissheit und Zuverlässigkeit, on the one hand, of Crusius, and the other one, Notwendige Vernunftwahrheit, those are, after all, two elements that can reconcile. And I think he's more strongly persistent than you're suggesting. Not least by his commitment to enlightenment in the and characters about
No doubt.
as empirical as you can get, when he wants to talk about the way in which philosophy should direct it.
Yes, he wants it to have a practical purpose, but he also wants it to have a foundation which.
Yes, but the foundation then is in the concepts. The concepts are not empty, and the substance is not full. It's not without form.
Yeah, but Crusius is saying you can't, the edifice of concepts will never be sufficient, that it
Yes,
could
I don't want
be.
to, I think that we can't too close to Crusius insofar as that makes him look as if he was a less confident reconciler of these opposites than I think he was.
Yeah, I suppose it may be to do with what he saw as the method for reconciling. He saw it as, sorting out the conceptual framework, the cognitive categories that we have, and then that can be filled by experience. It needs experience in order to exist at all. Whereas Crusius is less convinced about our ability to have that pure and empty framework which experience can fill. He doesn't think concepts are good enough, frankly.
No, but I'm quite glad to accept your view that he is not quite as Kantian as Kant.
No,
And when he tried the idea, of course, he drifted off into theology. I wonder why that was. Was it a career? Because theology was where the palace was, intellectually and socially. It may be that he was attracted away from mere philosophy, which was was only ceasing to be animated as a consequence.
That's an interesting point, Jim.
And the other thing is the last point. The move towards experience, I mean, roughly speaking, criticism is a dominant factor in literature as well as.
Sure.
As in philosophy, and you can't take these issues in abstraction from what's going on with it.
No. That would have to be another book, which I may have to write after what Kevin said.
Could I ask, Jerome, when you were positioning this at the start, and you said that one of the things you want to do with this project, or this part of it, is correct an imbalance in the secondary literature that sees Crusius as emphasising experience rather than abstraction. And how has that come about? Because from your portrayal of him, it's very surprising, as you said at the start. So is it clear how that happened? How this reading, in a sense, has come about?
It isn't clear to me. I mean, it may be that it is more a tendency now in recent research. I'd have to look into that, really, a kind of slightly more systematic analysis of if I was wanting to do a paper on Crusius reception. But I think it may be because of the knowledge of his teacher Hoffmann and the tradition that Hoffmann was in, that maybe that's just how he has been understood. But yeah, I mean, it's not that others don't recognize. Obviously, a big part of the literature is his inheritance to Kant, which is not particularly about existence. It's about the categories. It's about the distinction between form and matter, etc. So it's not true to say that's the only aspect of it.
Sure.
But there is a notable tendency to focus on, and no strong sense of the adherence to so many of these principles of rationalist thinking.
Yeah. Really interesting. Well, Jerome, I think this is what we really need. No pressure.
Yeah, whatever Kevin says.
It's going to be really interesting to see how it develops further. And thank you again for sharing that with us. I think we've all learned a lot.
Well, thanks for all your patience, time.